join as and when they see fit. So tēnā koutou katoa, ko ingarani me Piripini te whakapaparanga mai, ko Leicester me Bristol te whenua tupu, ko Tamaki Makaurau te kāinga. He Industry Research Liaison Manager o i New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, ko Kyla Archer toku ingoa, tēnā koutou katoa. On behalf of the New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, I'd like to welcome you all to the November edition of the Food Science Seminar Spotlight of 2023. Thank you for your patience as we rescheduled this event, but we are delighted today to host Frank Janner, an internationally renowned leader on food safety culture. Many of you will be familiar with Frank's work as a food safety leader and executive, food system futurist, author, professor, past president of the International Association of Food Protection and advocate for consumers. Most recently, he served under 2 different administrations as the Deputy Commissioner for the Food Policy and Response at the US FDA, a position he held from 2018 until earlier this year, 2023, after spending 30 years in leadership roles with 2 industry giants, Walmart and the Walt Disney Company. Throughout his career, Frank has been well recognized for his role in strengthening food safety standards in new and innovative ways, as well as building effective food safety management systems based on modern science-based and tech-enabled prevention principles. Today, he'll be talking to us about evidence-based ways to change or strengthen the food safety culture of an organization. Thank you for your time today, Frank. We'll follow up your presentation with a Q&A session after the presentation. So if you'd like to ask anything, please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the window, and I will raise them later. So thank you, Frank, and over to you.
Pleasure. Thank you, Kyla, for that warm introduction, and good morning, late morning, I understand, in New Zealand, but what a pleasure and honor it is to spend some time with you. Clearly, I would prefer to have done this in person, but conditions were such that we're going to do this by way of video or Zoom here. And there were a lot of topics we could talk about today, and I'm so grateful that so many people have an interest in food safety, food policy, and the future of food. But I was asked to speak about one of my favorite ones because I've seen over the course of my career why it's so important. And that topic is food safety culture, in particular food safety culture in organizations, some that I've worked in and some that I've regulated. Let me just begin by stating that I have been working in food safety for what I describe now a lifetime. I started my career at the Disney Company. I hope that many of you have had the chance to visit the theme parks, resorts, or maybe cruise lines. But I spent about 20 years as their director of safety and health, overseeing everything safety, whether it was food safety, attraction safety, guest safety, etc. After 20 years of a wonderful career working for the mouse, I decided to join the world's largest retailer, Walmart. In the US, their size is significant. Most people don't realize, but in the United States, about 1 out of every $4 spent on food is spent at a Walmart store. So it's a pretty big market share with 2.2 million employees around the world and operating in many countries. Loved my time at Walmart, learned a lot from them as well. And after 10 years at Walmart, I was recruited by commissioner at the FDA. The FDA has what I call commissioners and celebrity commissioners. He was a celebrity commissioner, Dr. Scott Gottlieb. Many of you may have seen him on some of the major news stations in the world during the COVID pandemic. But I like to say Dr. Scott Gottlieb convinced me to take a significant cut in pay, get rid of all my stocks, and move halfway around the country. But what an honor it was to serve the American people in our nation, especially during the midst of a global pandemic. But I like to jokingly say I went from the happiest place on earth, the Disney Company, to the busiest place on earth, a Walmart operations, and I went to the blank and I let people fill in what they think about FDA. Generally, when I say this in front of a public audience, we get some laughter, but I describe it as one of the most prestigious regulatory agencies on earth. And again, what an honor and privilege to have worked there. Let me begin with this thought, which isn't too novel, but I think it's worth stressing. It's the fact that the world around us is changing very rapidly. And I know if we were talking about change last decade or 20 years ago, people would say things are moving so fast. We now have pagers and we now have email. But there's no question in my mind that the pace of change is really fast. I heard this quote that really resonates with me, and it's this idea that the pace of change has never been this fast and it will never be this slow again. And that's true to our jobs in the area of food, food quality, and food safety. When I was growing up, if you visited a grocery store, you typically had about 15,000 food SKUs, stock keeping units in a grocery store. And I was impressed when I visited grocery stores with mom and dad in the early 80s. If you fast forward to the turn of the century, what did we see? The typical grocery store had 50,000 stock keeping units. But what's the world that we're living in? And granted, I know that the food system has a lot of headwinds and there's been a little bit of SKU consolidation, but I think by and large, the trend will continue with omni-channel, being able to buy products both within brick and mortar and online to the endless shelf. Being able to get online and buy the food that you want from anywhere in the world at any time. And so the food system is changing clearly. I also like to say that we're in the midst of a food revolution. And generally, when I'm in front of a public audience, I say, do you think I'm exaggerating? And I rarely get anyone who says, Frank, you're exaggerating. They all know that we are going to see more changes in food over the next 10 years than we have in the past 20 or 30. I'm living this as I travel and meet with clients all over the world and all over the US. The food system is changing. As we speak, we know there are a lot of food producers that are reformulating their food products. As we speak, there are new foods being realized, whether they're cell-cultivated meats that will be fully commercialized, whether it's gene-edited crops, whether it's plant-based foods, new foods. As we speak, I'm seeing a real revolution in automation and robotics and sensor technologies, producing foods differently than the way we had in the past. And as we speak, the food system is increasingly becoming digitized. We're in the midst of a food revolution. We have to make sure that these changes on balance are good for the planet, they're good for consumers, and they're good for businesses, and that they don't introduce risks. Here's another change that I want to share before we pivot and talk about this concept of food safety culture. What do these things have in common? The current global economic outlook, which oftentimes, at least according to the news outlets that I listen to, is mixed bags. I mean, it's really hard to say, are we going to enter in a recession, or are we having this soft landing that is often described? Political scandals. You might not have them in New Zealand, but we have our share here in the US. It's really outrageous. What do you believe that's reported on the news, whether it's traditional news, new news, Facebook, or Twitter, or now known as X, formerly known as Twitter? If you're like most, you generally don't believe what you hear. You want to validate, and you probably have sources that you trust. But increasingly, people no longer are believing what they hear, what's reported to them. And a food crisis, whether it's a food outbreak or a food scare. I'm showing a picture here of romaine lettuce. We've had a large outbreaks with romaine lettuce here in the US, and we just had an infant formula crisis last year. What do all these things have in common? You see, I think as professionals, we have to take a step back and say, where are these larger trend lines in society? And to me, it's that we're living in this day and age of a global trust bust. Consumers no longer trusting the institutions, the private sector, the sector that serves them. The data is clear. I just happen to pick some from Edelman Trust Barometer, does surveys every year that are pretty powerful. And you can see in the 2022 Edelman Trust Barometer that a majority of people did not believe what was on the news. A majority of people did not believe their political leaders, and a majority of people did not believe businesses. That's a trust bust. That's a problem for us as a society, as a planet, and certainly as food professionals. So what's the way forward? I just real quickly gave you some of the mega trends. I could go on for an hour talking about mega trends affecting our profession and the food system, but what's the way forward? I like to say that over my tenure, which is now approaching 3.5 decades of service, there have been traditional food safety and quality approaches. There have been training, and I know that today, some of you would say, Frank, our training today is better than it was in years past, doing risk-based training. And part of my intentions here today are to be a bit provocative, and I would tell you, while I agree that training and education probably has improved. At the end of the day, it doesn't really impress me much because we've been trying to train and educate our way to safer and better quality food for generations. Some might say, Frank, well, we're doing better inspections today, both from the public and private sector. There's third-party certifications. There's more rigid risk-based audits or inspections done by regulatory agencies. And again, respectfully, but trying to be provocative, I would say that answer doesn't impress me because inspections have been happening for a long, long time. We can never inspect at enough frequency, and you can't inspect safety into a product. And so that doesn't really impress me if that's your answer. And another tool that we've had in our toolbox is testing. I'm a bench level microbiologist, so I love microbiological testing. I know some will say, well, Frank, our testing today is so much better. We're using statistically sound sampling plans. We're using rapid methods. We're seeing proliferation in genetic testing capabilities. And again, I'd like to say, well, we've been testing our way to food safety for a long, long time, testing for salmonella, for example, in foods for over 100 years. And so that doesn't impress me. And so my hypothesis or suggestion to you is that we are entering an age where we need to add new tools to our toolbox. I'm encouraged. I'm optimistic about the future because I believe we're going to have a host of new tools that prior food safety professionals weren't able to utilize. And there are a host of tools of what I call high tech and high touch. Many of you know that I led an initiative at FDA called the New Era of Smarter Food Safety that was very much tech enabled and people led. But today I want to focus on high touch, which is really about human behavior, the insights that we now know about human behavior in organizational culture. And I'll start with this quote. And if you notice, this quote is from a behavioral psychologist and not a food scientist. And I do this intentionally. And it was Abraham Maslow who said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. You see, I think food safety professionals, at least during my era, were really focused on just limited tools. They had the training, the testing, and inspection tools. You know, they saw everything as a nail, and this that they were going to use. Again, I'm going to try to encourage you to add new tools to your toolbox if you haven't already done so, but I suspect many of you are already on your way. So some will say, well, Frank, well, how do we do this? Are you going to give us insights into the food safety program at some of these Fortune 100 brands? You know, you were able to work at Disney, you worked for Fortune 1, Walmart. At FDA, you certainly oversaw food safety for a lot of the world's major food producers. And I would say it's not about a food safety program. It never is. It's really about a food safety culture. And I think this audience understands there's a big difference between the two. And that's why I need to spend a few minutes on it. It really is about culture. Now, let me be clear. I'm always grateful when I get invited to talk about this. I would tell you about 20 years ago when I was talking and before I wrote or taught about food safety culture, I could remember talking about food safety culture at food safety conferences. In fact, I was at a IAFP, International Association for Food Protection annual meeting many years ago. And a past president loved the association, but I can remember to this day very vividly giving a talk at IFP on food safety culture. And after my presentation, person that I really admired in food safety, an icon or a legend, came up to me who will remain nameless, but said to me as a young professional back then, Frank, why are you talking about food safety culture here at IFP? This is a conference about the microorganisms, food science, the hard stuff. And I could remember being earlier in my career, I'll be transparent with you, my knees wobbled a little. This was an icon, a legend that I looked up to. And I said to him, I said, well, it's because working for the large organizations that I have, I think it's the soft stuff that's the hard stuff. Again, I think it's the soft stuff that's the hard stuff. You see, I found out very early in my career that I could hire people or I could get others, and myself included, to write some great HACCP plans. We could do a pretty good risk assessment, identify hazards. At that time, try to administer controls. You know, in the good old days, they were mainly what I would call administrative controls as opposed to engineering controls. But it required people to make this happen. And I discovered when you had workforces of 200,000 employees or a workforce of 2.2 million employees, that the soft stuff was really the hard stuff. How did you get people to do the things you needed them to do at the right time and at the right place? And that's when I became fixated on this concept of food safety culture. So in the time that we have left, we're going to go pretty succinctly, but I just want to give you an overview. I'm going to try to answer 4 basic questions. One is, what is culture? We'll go through this very quickly. I think most of the people on this call actually know what it is, what it isn't, but there's a reason why I like to answer it. Number 2, why? Why the focus on culture? I think the why from a human behavioral standpoint is powerful because it informs the action or the behavior. We'll spend a little bit of time on who creates culture in organizations. And then we'll spend most of our time with me giving you just a few examples of proven behavioral science principles on how to create a food safety or quality culture. And the how being real important. I don't know about you, but every once in a while I listen in on culture talks and seminars. They're common these days. And to be very candid with you, most of the times they leave me very unfulfilled because it's what I call a little bit of bubblegum food safety culture. You know, some pom-poms, rah, rah, rah. Let me be clear that the way you create a food safety culture is not through a tagline or a slogan, but it's leveraging proven behavioral science principles, blended with food science, obviously. So what is a food safety culture? The reason I like to share this one is because earlier in my career, I found that people had a hard time talking and really understanding. It was so abstract and soft that people didn't know. And while I'm not a proponent of us memorizing one specific definition, I am a proponent of food safety professionals understanding the core elements or concepts that make up an organizational culture. This is one from a book from a professor that I studied under, Dr. Carol Bryant, who's considered one of the 4 leaders in this behavioral science model called social marketing, using the same principles that we try to use to get people to visit our theme parks or buy our products, but using it for behavior change. And she and a couple other authors wrote this book called Social and Behavioral Foundations of Public Health. And one of the definitions I really liked there was culture is shared patterns of thoughts and behavior that characterize a social group. See, it isn't about an individual. It isn't even about a couple. It's an organization, right? Whether it be a company of 100 or 2.2 million, whether it's a country such as New Zealand at 5 million, whether it's more granular, maybe a town or a township. It's the shared patterns of thoughts and behaviors that group characterizes. Do they think about food safety? Is it something that they value, trying to keep others safe? Do they stay home if they're not working, if they work with food and they're not feeling well? Or when they enter the establishment, do they wash their hands? Do they know when they have to conduct the checks? It's characteristic of that social group in general. It can be learned through socialization processes. And I wish I had time to tell you how I seen up close and personal how food safety can be what I call caught and not just taught. I wish we had time for me to describe how I've seen this in person, that you can influence people's behaviors. Food safety can be caught just because of what they're seeing others do. If everybody's washing their hands at the right time, yeah, you want to teach it, but people see that and they know it's the cultural norm or the expectation around here. And if it's truly part of your culture, it persists through time. And what I like to say is it's no longer a program. It's no longer this year's focus or the flavor of the month. And leaders like Frank Giannis can come and go from organizations like Disney or Walmart, and those cultures can continue to persist. Granted, they need leadership and focus, but they don't dissipate as quickly as programs do. All right, so that's what a culture is. Why the focus on culture? And I want you to pause and just think about a catastrophic safety event that you remember, whether it was recently, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, just something catastrophic. And when societies experience these catastrophes, safety catastrophes, and they hire the smartest people, men, women, scientists, engineers to come together to investigate how in the heck did something like this happen and what do we do to prevent it from happening again. What do they always conclude? In fact, I like to say I have a pretty good crystal ball. I can just think of the next catastrophe that might happen, and I can predict right now what the headline will read. And it'll be this. Remember the BP oil spill? I considered that pretty catastrophic here in the US. Once that inquiry was done, what did they conclude? It was a culture of complacency. You see, the focus wasn't just on the cheap cement that BP had procured to build these oil rigs, but it was a culture that allowed that to happen. How about General Motors, one of the world's largest automobile manufacturers? Some of you will remember years ago they had ignition switch failures. This photo is a picture of a mother and father with their daughter who unfortunately tragically died due to an ignition switch failure in a GM automobile. They're testifying in front of the Congress in the United States. And you could see the GM recall probe was to blame the culture. See, they didn't focus so much on the electrical engineering mistakes that happened, which they could have, and they reported on them, but they said it was a culture, a siloed culture at General Motors, a siloed culture, which is a common weakness in large organizations, where the proper information wasn't making it to other parts of the organization to prevent this tragedy from happening. And then this is one of the ones that has probably been most illuminating for me over my career was the NASA Columbia shadow disaster. Shortly after takeoff from Kennedy Space Center in the United States, you see two tanks there with flame coming out of them. Those two tanks were filled with fuel. They also had an insulation material, foam insulation material around them. Really, literally, minutes after takeoff, some of the foam from one of those fuel tanks came off and hit the leading edge of the left wing. If you recall, the shuttle was lined with thermal insulation tile because when the shuttle re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, it experienced a tremendous amount of heat. Because the tile had been damaged and NASA wasn't sure about it, although they had contemplated it, they were aware that there was a little bit of a mishap. They decided to bring the shuttle home because that tile was damaged. Upon re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, the leading edge of the left wing started to vibrate. It eventually fractured, disintegrated into pieces, as did the entire shuttle, and 7 astronauts tragically on board were killed. So a blow to our nation's psyche. NASA published 2 large volumes in what they called an investigation report, volume 1 and 2. I read every single page of it. And there was one sentence in that report that really stood out to me. I've memorized it to this day. It said, the NASA organizational culture had as much to do with this accident as the foam. Once again, the soft stuff, not looking at just the engineering or the chemistry or physics behind the foam and the tile, but how NASA made a decision to bring that shuttle back home and didn't properly design it with the factors that they should have considered. So I like to say, I think, and I saw this firsthand and personal for 4.5 years overseeing food policy and response at FDA, that a lot of the food outbreaks and scares that we've seen in our nation and maybe all over the world have, I believe, more to do with culture than they do food science. I know that's a bold statement, but let me give you an example. The PCA outbreak of 2009, you can see up the left-hand corner. Shortly after this outbreak, many people around the world know there was a peanut paste producer in the United States, produced about 2 to 3% of the peanut paste, contaminated with salmonella, shipped it out to 800 plus people, documented confirmed cases, deaths. Shortly after the outbreak, what I started receiving in my inbox were papers from the trade associations talking about salmonella's ability to survive in a low moisture food. I like to say, I took General Micro in college probably around 2005. No, not 2005. I'm sorry, 1984, 1985. And I knew way back then about salmonella's ability to survive in a low moisture food. How about melamine in powdered infant formula? Do you think that's strictly the actually make a product appear higher in protein, or is it more about a culture that would allow that to happen. I would even say more recently, Chronobacter. Do you think Chronobacter in infant formula is just about processing, or do you think it's maybe a culture of complacency because of the low probability of detection and over-indexing, that if you get a negative test result on an N30 sampling plan, you're probably good? Or how about Listeria and ice cream? Again, I don't want to pick on any brands, but I use Bluebell as an example because it was the #1 share of ice cream in the United States. Here was a company that had existed for 108 years and never had a problem, never had a recall. 108 years. That's a pretty long legacy. Do you see a company like that maybe being lulled into a culture of complacency, thinking, well, Listeria and ice cream, it doesn't multiply, it's a frozen good, and not realizing that the world around them had changed, which we now moved away from PFG to whole genome sequencing. Sometimes these products do get used in a variety of different ways. Worst case was actually slacked or thawed a bit, mixed into a milkshake and fed to really high risk immunocompromised cancer patients at a hospital. And so the bottom line is, I think in many outbreaks, it's often about culture, although we as food safety professionals don't document or write it that way. Who creates culture? I'm going to pick up the tempo here. Well, organizational cultures are created by leaders. It's never created from the bottom up. And here's a quote from one of the founding fathers on organizational culture, Edgar Schein, who's since passed away, but if you get a chance to read any of his books, you'll be impressed. Organizational cultures are created by leaders, and one of the most decisive functions of leadership may well be the creation, the management, and if and when necessary, the destruction of culture. Culture is a leadership function. Here's a quote from a very, I would say, astute Greek philosopher. If we were in person, I hope somebody would chuckle. It's a little bit of sarcasm there, but a food safety culture or a quality culture is a choice. I was recently giving advice to a Fortune 100 food company, and they asked me, who in the United States has a strong food safety culture, or what food companies? And this is a recent example, and I'm sharing it with you because I found my answer so dissatisfying. I said, well, Jack in the Box has a strong food safety culture. Chipotle has a strong food safety culture. Maple Leaf, involved with the Listeria outbreak in Canada, they have a strong food safety culture. And I just found that I was pointing to companies that had a catastrophic event. In that event, they started working on their food safety culture. I think you're probably tuning in today because we don't want to wait for the catastrophic event. The goal is, as professionals, how do we create these strong food safety cultures in our organizations or in our influences, or spheres of influence before there's a tragic consequence? So the last one is the most important question, which is how? How is the culture created? And you've asked me to talk about organizations that have strong food safety cultures. What I've discovered is that no two food safety cultures are alike, just like no two people are alike. They all have their unique DNA, but what I've found is they have some common attributes. And I'll list them here. I've tried to distill them down for simplicity into 5 core elements. 1, they create high food safety and quality expectations. Everybody in the organization knows their role in producing safe food. They educate and train their employees on how to produce safe food and why it's important. They communicate the importance of food safety and quality frequently. Culture and communication are 2 sides of the same coin. I told you, you just can't get there with communication alone, but you can't get there without communication. They establish good food safety and quality goals and measurements, and they create consequences for food safety and quality behaviors. Consequences, both positive and negative consequences. And you can think about this as a continuous improvement model, with the top of this continuous improvement circle being the expectations. You then train and educate around them. You continue to move in a clockwise fashion. You then communicate, you establish goals, and you measure, and then you reinforce, and you just drive the continuous improvement cycle over and over again. But I'm going to try to go through these really quickly just to give you some examples. How do you create high and why high food safety performance expectations. I like to say, hey, when I was working at the world's largest retailer, if I told operators, hey, I'm okay with 3 critical violations per inspection, how many critical violations per inspection do you think the brand would average? I like to say, if you've raised children, you might answer 4, certainly 3, not less. So the quality of your expectations influences the quality of your actions and others. I also like to ask the question, what's the number one reason why employees don't do what they're supposed to do? And if you're interested, this was a good book. It was a New York Times bestseller titled Why Employees Don't Do What They're Supposed to Do and What to Do About It. According to the research that they did in a variety of different businesses, the number one reason why employees don't do what they're supposed to do is pretty shameful. They don't know what to do. I always say, whose fault is that? Employees in an organization not knowing what to do? It's not the employee's fault. That's a leadership failure. And so I think you have to make those expectations real crystal clear for employees. This was one simple example of a strategy that I use. I'll give you some examples real quickly and succinctly just for illustrative purposes. But we said, hey, we want anybody that works with food to know that these are the 5 most things they need to know and the behaviors that they need to take. Number 1, be clean, be healthy. That means don't come to work if you're not feeling well. Wash your hands before working with food, after using the restroom, touching a dirty surface, etc. And the third icon there is don't touch ready-to-eat foods with your bare hands. High five number 2, keep it cold, keep it hot, and taught and trained how do you keep foods hot above 140 or above, or cold 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Don't cross-contaminate. If you're going to be working on a chain broiler and you're cooking raw hamburgers, but you're expected to assemble them and maybe load buns, how do you prevent cross-contamination? Wash, rinse, and sanitize, the importance of cleanliness, and then cooking it and chilling it. So make the expectations clear. This is just very quick one example. The other thing, in terms of expectations, I believe we're better off from a behavioral standpoint of linking food safety to our values and beliefs as opposed to policies. And here's just one study that's right out of the behavioral science literature where they took this concept. What's a better motivator? Is it a written policy or a law, or is it linking to a person's values? And what they did is in the United States, we have something called affirmative action. Don't want to be political here, but it's a policy, government policy and affirmative action on making sure that we take into account the importance of minorities being represented in all sections of society. And they took a class, they divided it into 2 groups. They asked them to read an opinion paper. Both groups had the same paper. They didn't realize this. But one, they billed it as an opinion paper on the policy affirmative action. The second one, they billed it of equality. They then measured pre and post people's perspectives on the policy of affirmative action, and they wanted to see which ones were more influential in getting people's viewpoints to change. And which ones do you think did? It was the people that thought they were reading an editorial on the value of equality. And so I say link food safety to your organization's values and beliefs. Most organizations have them, and you'll be more successful. Retailer W, Walmart, I linked food safety to the company's 3 basic beliefs. They respect the individual was one of their basic beliefs. And so we said, if you respect the individual, you have to care about their safety. And then we gave them specific behaviors that we wanted them to follow. And I always say, if I'm entering a new organization, this is where I'm going to start. I'm going to start trying to link food safety to the organization's values and beliefs, its DNA, because people will be more excited to comply with something that aligns with their beliefs than a government policy. Number 2, I told you an important core element is educating and training employees on food safety. You can train them, I think, in their native language. Used to be there was debate on do you teach people in their native language or not. I think on safety, you have to teach them in their native language. I like to draw a distinction between education and training. If we were in person, I would ask this question and I'd see some people look at me oddly. And then I always say, well, let me ask you, how many of you have teenagers in high school? And I see the hands go up. And then I ask provocatively, what would you rather they receive in high school? sex education or sex training. If we were in a classroom setting, there would be a lot of laughter right now, but it's to make this point that training and education are different. Education is why, but the training is how to do it. And I find oftentimes food safety professionals use this terminology incorrectly. And oftentimes we're so fixated on the education, we call it training, but we've got to show people how to actually do the work. And we can leverage behavioral science principles and how we educate and train. We're not training just to check a regulatory requirement. We're not training just to impart knowledge. That's good. We're not training just to change attitudes. That's even better. But we're training to change human behavior. And so how do we do that? One behavioral science principle you can leverage is this principle of commitment. I'll tell you the principle right here real simply through a study that I researched. And it's this idea that if you commit to something in writing or verbally, your behaviors are much more likely to follow. And this has been clearly proven in the behavioral science literature. This was a restaurant in Chicago that had a very high cancellation rate. It was a small restaurant. But when you called this restaurant to make a reservation, the receptionist would say, please call if you're going to cancel your reservation. End of story, hung up the phone. And guess what happened? About a third of callers never showed up. Really difficult to manage a small spaced, high premium restaurant when a third of your customers, you're holding tables for them and they don't show up. Using this behavioral science principle, they advised the restaurant, well, listen, when the guest calls to make a reservation, leverage the principle by simply adding 2 words and a question mark. Instead of saying, please call, ask the question, will you please call if you're going to cancel your reservation? Pause and wait for an answer. So what do you think happened? The majority of callers would say, yes, of course, we'll call you if we're going to cancel the reservation. They then measured what happened over time, and what do you think happened? A dramatic reduction in no-shows. Now, you might say, Frank, this seems too difficult or too far of a stretch to believe. There are many studies, and I can't tell you more right now, but directionally, this principle of human behavior, if you write something or you say something verbally, you're much more likely to do it. Because our human nature is we don't want to be known as flip-floppers, right? Who wants a flip-flopper politician? Do you want to hire a flip-flopper or somebody that's inconsistent in your workforce? The answer is no. So we leverage this principle of commitment when we did training and education. As opposed to getting a signature to hold people accountable, we asked people to commit to employ the skills and knowledge they were provided during the training session. I have permission to use this. That's an example from a while ago, but Fonterra, we had some of the Fonterra professionals come through my course at Michigan State University. They went back and they put this promise on the entry of their food production facilities. I was able to tour one of the facilities and took this picture. I was just blown away. They put a photograph of the person that works in the plant, and basically that is their commitment or their promise to what they call uncompromised food safety and world-class quality. Do you think that influences your behavior when every day you have to walk by the picture and the promise that you made? Of course it does. We used this technique when we were trying to drive hand washing up. We had employees get finger paint, a fun exercise, talked about the importance of hand washing, certainly taught them how to do it. It wasn't that they didn't know how to when they needed, but we had them commit by placing their handprints on a board and then placing that board over a hand sink. So training and education and some behavioral science principles. Number 3, communicate food safety frequently. I told you communication and culture are 2 sides of the same coin. Use a host of communication methods. A couple of tips real quickly, because again, I spend a whole semester on these concepts. But one is what I found in most organizations, the number one way people like to hear or receive information is from their leader. If you don't know how your employees like to receive information, you should ask them. You should do a survey as opposed to pretending you know. Use a redundancy of communication strategies. We live in a very noisy world, and you want to increase the noise to signal ratio. Signs and symbols are powerful if they're really good, effective signs and symbols. Figure out who's an authority or who's an influencer. You know, I rarely was the one in the suit and tie trying to deliver messages to frontline employees because I don't think they wanted to hear from the talking head from headquarters. You can see I used a country music fan here in the United States called Trace Adkins to talk to our group about food allergies because he had a daughter that had food allergies and he was a famous celebrity. The picture on the left is a picture of an employee, Jarrell. We ended up using this fella in commercials nationwide on a strategy that we call rollback prices, but he was so dynamic, so interactive, and he really worked in our store that we ended up using him to deliver a lot of our food safety messages. By the way, that's leveraging human behavioral science, principle homophily or likeness, which is in this day and age that I told you about a consumer trust bust. Who do you believe? Well, you tend to believe a person like you more than others. And then ask questions. I'm going to move on. Establish goals and measurements. I like this ABC model. The A being the antecedent to human behavior. The goal is the antecedent. Have goals for your food safety metrics or performance desires. Measure both leading and lagging indicators. As a profession, I think we over-index on lagging indicators, how many recalls, how many illnesses. This day and age where we can digitize data, we can take big data and turn it into powerful predictive and prescriptive information. And these are all the visual points I'm trying. And then let me just tell you from a behavioral science viewpoint, one more thing that I think is really important. I say, why do we measure food safety? And people often say, well, Frank, it's to understand if we're getting better, staying the same, or getting worse. It's a really good answer. The other reason I think we should measure is to innovate. If you see you have out of compliance rates, how can you change what you're doing to drive compliance up as opposed to accepting the same metric for 2 years or a decade? But another reason we should measure from a human behavior standpoint is to catch people doing things right. That's right, to catch people doing things right. I tell this of auditors. I'd say you'll get better results if you measure to catch people doing things right. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're finding something that's out of compliance, you're not going to document it, that you're not going to advise on how to correct or instruct. But you're going in there with the bias of trying to catch. You're going to be a fair umpire, what I say. You're going to call balls and strikes fairly. But this viewpoint of trying to catch people doing things right, I think only gets you more of that type of in-compliance behavior. And that leads to the last concept that I do think organizations that have strong food safety cultures do well is they create appropriate consequences, both positive or negative. You can call it reinforcement for behaviors. And we've all known and studied in the behavioral science literature that positive consequences on a ratio of 4 to positive to 1 negative, sometimes greater, tend to get better results, whether they're in the classroom, whether they're on the manufacturing plant floor. And so create tiered recognition, whether it's on the spot, if you pass an audit, an annual recognition process. And here's a photo of a procedure that we had at Disney many years ago. And what this photo doesn't show is Chef Tiffany there and Dieter Hannig, who was the vice president at the time of food and beverage for theme parks and resorts, were flanked by their teams. So excited to win what we called the food safety partner Mickey, just a glass sculptured, one of a kind, glass sculptured Chef Mickey. They performed hard every year because they wanted to be recognized annually as the food safety partner winner. So I gave you a lot, but remember these attributes of the food safety and quality culture. I actually say these are leadership responsibilities, not accountabilities. These are responsibilities. If you want to be a leader in food safety, you have to create high food safety and quality expectations. You have to ensure that everyone in your organization is trained and educated. You have to create ways to communicate food safety frequently. You got to establish goals and measurements, and you got to reinforce those behaviors. And so with that, I think we got through it. I know it was a lot of material. I wanted to get all of those points across, but I think we'll have some time to try to answer some questions. If you're interested in the topic, not trying to sell books, but I have written 2 books on it, and I do teach a course every year at Michigan State University. We'll teach it again in June of 2024, and I'm so grateful. We've had participants on multiple occasions, multiple years from New Zealand. So with that, I'll pause and see, Kyla, if you want to try to facilitate a little bit of Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Frank. That was really insightful, and I'm new to the food safety area as well, so it's great to hear about the soft stuff that is also the hard stuff. I'm just going to take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Libby Harrison, who is the director for the Food Safety Science and Research Centre, and I think she's got some questions for you as well. And then
Sure.
whilst they come in from our attendees, I've got a couple already, then I can launch into those when you've had your little conversation.
Great.
Fiora, greetings, Frank. Thank you so much for that presentation. I've watched a number of your presentations online, and you always make it so fresh and new, and I learn something new each time. So thank you. And my colleague, Wendy Newport-Smith, attended your course earlier this year, and she got a huge amount out of it, and she's currently studying her PhD, and I know that your thinking and your course is informing her undoubted success in being awarded a PhD. So I was really struck by you talking about the soft stuff is the hard stuff, and it really is, and I think it can resonate with us. I personally ended up working in an organization where my values didn't fit that organization. It wasn't related to food safety, but I think that soft stuff is really important. And I quickly realized I needed to move on, and was lucky enough to do that. And also your examples of big disasters. I mean, New Zealand has had its fair share of big disasters, and one that really came to mind was we had a coal mining incident back about 13 years ago now at the Pike River mine on the west coast of the South Island, and I think it was around 29 of the miners were killed in an explosion, and it has significantly changed our health and safety legislation in a way that I really hope is helping to improve culture in relation to health and safety. And it absolutely undoubtedly was related to the culture of not just the miners, but particularly of the leaders who were leading that organization. So great resonance for me. Now, the New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre is primarily all about science and research. It's kind of in the name. And we're co-funded by industry, and we were established after a food safety incident, which luckily was a scare, which you're probably familiar with.
Yeah.
And so we're here to support industry. We're co-funded by government, but we need to make sure we're providing the science and research that industry needs to be effective in producing food, and it's food safety science and research. And this might be a bit of a mean question, but for many of our companies, probably food safety culture is something new and something that they want to embrace. We're hearing that. And I just wondered whether you had any advice for kind of like an entry-level piece of research or science, or what would be that kind of first step that you would recommend for us to help those industry members?
Yeah, well, Dr. Harrison, a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for those comments. They were very forceful, the example both in coal mining, and I'm very familiar with the whey protein scare. And I actually was impressed with the way MPI actually emphasized food safety culture in their investigation report. It was one of those rare pinnacle moments that I think gave a lot of wind in the sails to this important issue. And I'm grateful that your organization is taking a look at this. You know, I always advise people, to me, I have found if you're trying to manage food safety, it's not an easy job. The reality is we haven't automated everything. We don't have robots and machines doing it all. It's still, food production is still very large a human endeavor. In fact, that's why during the pandemic, we saw such large disruptions, right? Because if you start affecting workforces, food doesn't get made, it doesn't get transported. But I feel that oftentimes, and it's certainly during my tenure, we came out of the colleges with a real grasp of food science, but not a strong grasp on behavioral science. We might have taken general psych. And so one of the things I always talk about is, to be successful, I think you're not going to be a behavioral or social scientist, obviously, if you're a food scientist. but you should just at least whet your appetite and read a little bit on behavioral science. Understand what are the best behavioral change theories or models. Understand a little bit about some of these models that I talked about, social marketing. Understand a little bit about organizational culture. And if you don't have the appetite, hire people on your team that behavioral science together that will make you, produce better interventions and allow you to think about the process. I say, as a food scientist, we think about the processes, right? As a behavior-based food scientist, I think about the processes and the people. As a food scientist, I just think about food science. As a behavioral-based food safety professional, I think about food science and behavioral science. So I think it's just start by trying to learn a little bit more or empowering your team members to learn a little bit more. But I assure you this, and you might think, Giannis is a little bit arrogant and overly confident. I promise you, if you take a little bit more of a behavioral-based approach to your work, you'll get better results.
Great. Thank you very much.
So we've got a few questions, and some of them can kind of be linked together. So I'm just going to kind of ask it as one. So how do we proactively get organizations to look into their toolkit before it's too late? And how do we change senior leaders' mindsets on culture being an important thing to focus on? And then kind of on the flip side of that, how can those outside an organization nudge it to look at its culture?
Yeah, those are great questions. And Kyla, you've combined a few questions together. That was really good. But I would say, one of the things I've learned the hard way is, what do you think is a more powerful motivator of human behavior? Is it hope of gain, hope of success, or fear of failure? Some in your audience might say, it's hope of gain or hope of success. The reality, fear of failure motivates more humans than hope of gain or hope of success. So, you don't want to do this shamefully, but you do want to hold up examples of organizations that got it wrong, like the ones that I just described here. I mean, if you go talk to them, and I have, they all had overconfidence. They hadn't done good risk assessments. They all had a culture that led them to a sense of complacency. We talk about complacency. What is complacency? And, try to pick relevant examples that might be useful to influence your leadership or whoever you're trying to influence, to say that this could happen to us too if we don't take it seriously. So that's one thing I would do, is use real world examples of companies that thought they were doing a good job, that had the catastrophic events. And the goal is we don't want to be that. I used to use one example. I mentioned Jack in the Box. A lot of your listeners will remember the Jack in the Box outbreak of 1993, I think it was. Well, the fellow that they hired to lead that was a person by the name of Dr. Dave Thino, who has since passed away. But I remember having dinner with Dr. Thino, and literally at dinner, I can remember like it was yesterday, he took out his wallet and he took out a picture of a little girl that died in the Jack in the Box outbreak. And he told me, Frank, I've been carrying this picture around with me for the last 15 years to remind me of why food safety is important at Jack in the Box. Well, what I did is I went back to my employers and I put a slide of all the people that had died to foodborne illnesses in the U.S. over the past few years. And I said to the executive team at Walmart, I said, what do you think all these people have in common? And a lot of them didn't know. And I said, they all died due to a foodborne illness. And then I told them the story of Dave Thino. And I said, I don't know about you, but I never want to carry a picture around of a customer to remind me why food safety is important. So I've used some of those strategies. They're not scare tactics. They're just, hey, behind all these foodborne disease statistics that we hear, there are real people and real faces. In the last part of that question is, how can we use others? I think you're in a good place with MPI being a proponent of it, and even your research institute. When I was at FDA, we launched something called the New Era of Smarter Food Safety, and I made it one of 4 pillars, knowing that regulators should be also asking for stronger food safety cultures, because if you have stronger food safety cultures in the organizations that you regulate, you're going to drive up rates of compliance. And so I'd love to see industry understand it and want to do it. I'd love to see regulators promoting it more. Should demand it. The consumer groups should be demanding food safety culture.
Great, thank you. Just talking about NPI, I'm sure you're familiar with Roger Cook, who's one of the directors there. He just said, brilliant and insightful as always. Yes, businesses are ultimately responsible and accountable for their product safety, but it's poor culture, hence poor safety performance, a reflection of similar poor food safety culture in their external businesses, and science advisors, regulators, verifiers, and auditors. So it's across the country's whole food safety assurance system. And this is probably quite a big question considering we've only got a few minutes left, but perhaps you would comment on your experience making the movie Poisoned, which is available on Netflix, with respect to how they portrayed culture in business and at the FDA and USDA, and demonstrated a brand of culture in commentators and media educators.
Yeah. So for your audience, I did write an opinion column on my role in the movie Poisoned, and it wasn't because I was upset, but I actually posted on LinkedIn. I said, I participated in the movie. First of all, Kyla, people ask me, well, why would you be willing to participate in a movie that we knew was going to be fairly aggressive? You worked for the federal government. You knew they were going to be tough on it. I participated at a principle, which is number one, if you work in the public sector, I think you have an obligation to answer the tough questions for the public that you serve. Although there was debate at FDA whether we should do it or not, I wanted to be there. I did say there's a lot to like about the movie Poison. The whole thing we're talking about today, that it's about real risk and real consequences, and hearing from people that suffer tragic consequences, that there's still too much foodborne illness and that there's more we can do. But I did like to say that most of what I said ended up on the cutting room floor, and I wish some things else would have been included. And that is some of the great work that's happening both in the public and private sector. I also think the movie was, in my opinion, short on solutions. And so it's one thing to identify we've got a problem, but what do you do about it? And so in my opinion column, I tried to give some examples of things we can do to try to solve it. And so I don't want to be negative. If you haven't seen the movie Poison, I would encourage you to view it. I think it paints the entire private sector food industry in a negative light, when I know there are some private sector entities that are doing a lot of good work. In fact, some of the greatest advancements that have happened in food safety in my generation have come out of the private sector. HACCP, for example, was invented by Pillsbury and NASA. And so I've been saying I'd like to see Poison 2. That's a little bit more focused on solution, and Kyla in it. So I like to jokingly say I'll be back.
Great, thanks. No, it was really interesting, and I watched it I think on a Friday night after work, and so it was kind of like a busman's holiday, like working all day in food safety research and then going and watching a thing about it. But it was really insightful for me as someone who's fairly new to the situation to come and watch. Livy, did you have anything to add before I wrap up?
No, just joining to make sure I'm present for the farewell.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a really great webinar. We're so pleased that we were able to make this work. It was always a challenge across the time zones, but I'm really glad that it was able to happen. Thank you, everybody, for staying to the end. We have recorded this, and it will be available on our website shortly. So if you want to share it with colleagues in your organization, perhaps to help encourage people to start taking those steps, for those senior leaders that might need a bit more of encouragement, then that would be really good to share as well. We are hoping to have a final session for the year in the middle of December, so stay tuned. The information will be in your inboxes, and enjoy the rest of your week and the rest of your day, and have a lovely Monday evening, Frank. Ka kite ano.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you.